The courtroom fell silent as an elderly man shuffled through the heavy wooden doors. His worn-out shoes barely made a sound against the polished floor, and his faded brown suit hung loosely on his thin frame. The jacket had clearly seen better days, with patches carefully sewn onto the elbows and a slight fraying at the cuffs. The man's weathered hands clutched a small leather briefcase that looked as old as he did. As he made his way to the defendant's table, a few whispers echoed through the gallery. The prestigious Superior Court of downtown usually saw well-dressed lawyers and businesspeople, not someone who looked like they'd walked straight out of a thrift store. Judge Richard Thompson, known for his stern demeanor and zero tolerance for time-wasters, peered down from his bench. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight before him. The elderly man was here to contest a multi-million-dollar property dispute against one of the city's largest real estate development companies. "Are you representing yourself today?" the judge asked, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, including from the opposing counsel's table where three lawyers in expensive suits sat with smug expressions. The elderly man stood straight, despite his aging frame, and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Yes, Your Honor. I am." Judge Thompson couldn't help but let out a short laugh. "And you understand this is a complex case involving multiple property laws and corporate regulations?" "I do, Your Honor," the man replied, maintaining his dignity despite the growing snickers from the gallery. The judge shook his head, almost pitying the old man. "Very well. Please present your opening statement." The elderly man carefully opened his worn briefcase, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The opposing lawyers exchanged knowing glances, clearly expecting this to be over quickly. But as the man began to speak, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. 30 years ago, he started, his voice growing stronger, I was a janitor at the old Miller building. Every night, I would clean the offices, including that of Mr. Miller himself. One evening, I noticed some documents had fallen behind a cabinet. When I retrieved them, I discovered they were the original property deeds to several downtown lots. The judge's amused expression began to fade as the old man continued his story. The opposing lawyers suddenly sat up straighter, their smiles disappearing. Mr. Miller had been keeping these deeds hidden because they contained a crucial clause: if the properties were ever sold for commercial development, 30% of the profits would go to a trust for the city's homeless shelters. When Mr. Miller passed away, his son sold those properties to Greater Valley Development Corporation, but that clause was mysteriously absent from the new deeds. The elderly man reached into his briefcase again, this time pulling out several yellowed documents protected in plastic sleeves. "I kept copies of those original deeds, Your Honor. I've spent the last 3 decades working as a night janitor in law firms, using my free time to study property law in their libraries. I'm here today not just for myself, but for the people of this city who were denied what was rightfully theirs." Judge Thompson leaned forward, his earlier amusement completely gone. The opposing lawyers hurriedly whispered among themselves, shuffling through their expensive leather portfolios. As the elderly man laid out document after document, each one meticulously preserved and annotated, the gallery watched in stunned silence. This wasn't just about property rights anymore, it was about justice, patience, and the power of determination. The judge's gaze shifted between the documents and the elderly man, seeing him in a completely new light. The shabby suit and worn briefcase told a story of sacrifice, of a man who had dedicated his life to uncovering the truth, no matter how long it took. The afternoon sun streamed through the high courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the floor. But for the first time in decades, the truth about the Miller properties was finally coming to light, brought forth by the most unlikely of advocates. And this was just the beginning of a case that would shake the city's powerful real estate empire to its very foundation. The revelation of the original deeds sent shockwaves through the courtroom. As the elderly man, who introduced himself as Mr. Chen, continued his presentation, the story he unveiled was more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. "Your Honor," one of the corporate lawyers interrupted, standing abruptly. "We question the authenticity of these documents. Anyone could have fabricated these papers over the years." Judge Thompson raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Chen, can you prove these documents are original?" A slight smile crossed Mr. Chen's weathered face as he pulled out another set of papers from his briefcase. "I anticipated this question, Your Honor. Over the years, I didn't just study law, I also built relationships with people who could help verify the truth." He gestured to the back of the courtroom, where an elderly woman slowly made her way forward. She walked with a cane but carried herself with unmistakable authority. "This is Mrs. Rodriguez, Your Honor. She was Mr. Miller's personal secretary for over 20 years before his death." The opposing lawyers exchanged worried glances as Mrs. Rodriguez took the stand. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at the judge. "I remember the day Mr. Chen found those documents like it was yesterday. I was working late that evening, and I saw him discover them behind that old cabinet. Mr. Miller had been acting strangely about those properties for months." As Mrs. Rodriguez testified, she revealed that she had kept her own detailed records of Mr. Miller's business dealings. "I knew something wasn't right when his son started changing things after his death. But I was just a secretary, who would listen to me? When Mr. Chen approached me years later, showing me what he'd found, I knew I had to help." The judge listened intently as she described how she and Mr. Chen had spent years quietly gathering evidence. They had created a network of former employees, maintenance workers, and even retired courthouse clerks who had witnessed pieces of the puzzle over the decades. "But why wait so long to bring this to court?" Judge Thompson asked, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. Mr. Chen stepped forward again. "Your Honor, I needed to understand the law completely. I couldn't afford law school, so I learned wherever and whenever I could. During my night shifts, I'd read legal textbooks, study case law, and take detailed notes. Sometimes, I'd work multiple jobs just to save enough money to make copies of documents or consult with experts." He pulled out a stack of notebooks, each one filled with careful handwriting, legal citations, and newspaper clippings. "I watched as Greater Valley Development Corporation grew more powerful each year. They built luxury condos where affordable housing should have been. They tore down community centers that could have been saved by the trust money. I needed to make sure that when I finally brought this case forward, it would be impossible to dismiss." The corporate lawyers huddled together, frantically whispering and shuffling through their papers. Their carefully prepared defense was crumbling in the face of decades of meticulous preparation. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Mr. Chen continued, "I have here affidavits from 3 former board members of Greater Valley Development Corporation." He produced another set of documents, each one bearing notarized signatures. These individuals were present when the decision was made to lose the original deed restrictions. They've agreed to testify about how the company systematically worked to hide the truth. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Judge Thompson banged his gavel for order, but even he couldn't hide his astonishment at the thoroughness of Mr. Chen's evidence. One of the corporate lawyers stood up again, his confidence noticeably shaken. "Your Honor, even if these documents are genuine, the statute of limitations has not expired," Mr. Chen interrupted calmly. "As my research shows, the clock began ticking not when the properties were sold, but when the fraud was discovered. I can cite several precedents, including the landmark case of Henderson versus Riverside Development, 1987, where the court held." As Mr. Chen expertly laid out his legal arguments, the judge's expression changed from surprise to respect. This wasn't just about old documents anymore. It was about a man who had dedicated his life to justice, working in the shadows of the very system he sought to challenge. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from her seat with pride. She remembered all those late nights when Mr. Chen would show up at her house after his shift, sharing his latest findings over cups of tea. They had become unlikely friends, united by their commitment to revealing the truth. The afternoon wore on as Mr. Chen methodically presented each piece of evidence. He had newspaper clippings showing the gradual transformation of the neighborhood, testimonies from families who had been forced out by rising rents, and detailed financial analyses showing how much money should have gone to the community trust. Judge Thompson checked his watch, realizing they had gone well past the court's usual closing time. But no one in the courtroom seemed eager to leave. They all sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary, the moment when decades of patient, determined work finally came to light. "We'll resume tomorrow morning," the judge announced, gathering his papers. But before dismissing the court, he looked directly at Mr. Chen. "I owe you an apology, sir. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance. You've reminded us all that justice often comes from unexpected places." As people filed out of the courtroom, Mr. Chen carefully packed up his briefcase. A young law student who had been watching the proceedings approached him. "Sir, how did you stay motivated all these years? Weren't you ever tempted to give up?" Mr. Chen paused, considering the question. "When you believe in something bigger than yourself," he replied softly, "time becomes your ally, not your enemy." He smiled at the student and walked toward the door, his worn shoes echoing in the nearly empty courtroom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, the truth was finally having its day in court. The next morning, an unexpected crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Word had spread about Mr. Chen's testimony, and dozens of community members showed up to witness the proceedings. Among them were former residents who had been priced out of their homes, local activists, and even a few retired city officials who remembered the original Miller properties. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Greater Valley Development Corporation's legal team had been up all night, and they came armed with a new strategy. Their lead attorney, looking sharp in an expertly tailored suit, approached the bench with confident steps. "Your Honor, we've uncovered some concerning information about the plaintiff," he announced, his voice carrying through the packed courtroom. Mr. Chen's credibility should be called into question. "We have evidence suggesting he was terminated from several janitorial positions over the years." Mr. Chen remained calm, his hands folded quietly on the table before him. Judge Thompson turned to him. "Would you like to address these allegations?" Standing slowly, Mr. Chen straightened his worn suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. I was indeed let go from several positions, each time after accessing their law libraries or asking too many questions about property records." He pulled out another notebook from his briefcase. "I kept detailed records of each termination, including dates, reasons given, and witnesses. Interestingly, most of these dismissals occurred shortly after I requested information about the Miller properties." The corporate lawyer's triumphant smile faltered. Mr. Chen continued, "In fact, I have here a pattern of systematic interference with my research. Each time I got close to important documents, would suddenly find myself unemployed. But I never stopped. I simply found another job, another law library, another piece of the puzzle." From the gallery, a man in his 60s stood up. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Thompson nodded, intrigued. "I'm the former head librarian at City Law Library. I remember Mr. Chen well. He would come in after his night shifts, sometimes having worked double shifts just to have time to study during the day. When certain law firms tried to block his access, I helped him find other resources. I watched this man teach himself law, case by case, precedent by precedent." The corporate lawyers huddled together, whispering urgently. Their attempt to discredit Mr. Chen had backfired, only serving to highlight his determination and the forces that had tried to stop him. But they weren't done yet. The lead attorney produced a thick stack of papers with a flourish. "Your Honor, we have evidence that the alleged trust clause would have been illegal under the property laws of that time. We have experts ready to testify that such an arrangement wouldn't have been possible." Mr. Chen's eyes lit up with an almost youthful spark. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a leather-bound book that looked even older than he was. "I'm glad you brought this up, Counselor. This is the 1960 edition of State Property Statutes. Section 47.3 specifically allowed for charitable trusts to be tied to property sales, provided certain conditions were met. He opened the book to a marked page. Mr. Miller structured his clause precisely according to these requirements. I found this book in a used bookstore 10 years ago. It was quite fortunate, as this edition was later replaced and many people forgot about this provision. The judge leaned forward, genuinely impressed. You seem to have anticipated every challenge, Mr. Chen. I had to, Your Honor. I learned early on that the truth isn't enough, you need to protect it from every possible angle of attack. As the morning wore on, more community members came forward to testify. A retired city clerk described how certain documents had mysteriously vanished from public records. A former maintenance worker from the Miller building recalled conversations he had overheard about the properties. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle Mr. Chen had spent decades assembling. During the lunch recess, reporters gathered outside the courthouse, trying to interview anyone connected to the case. Mr. Chen quietly ate a simple sandwich on a bench in the corridor, watching as people hurried past. A young journalist approached him, notebook in hand. Sir, how does it feel to finally have your day in court? Mr. Chen thought for a moment, carefully wiping his hands with a paper napkin. This was never about me, he replied softly. This is about a promise that was made to the community, a promise that got buried under paperwork and greed. Sometimes, the only way to fight a system is to understand it better than those who built it. Back in the courtroom, Greater Valley's legal team tried a new approach. They offered to settle the case, a substantial sum that would have made Mr. Chen a wealthy man. The lead attorney presented the offer with a knowing smile, certain that a man who had spent his life in poverty would jump at the chance for financial security. The gallery held its breath, waiting for his response. Mr. Chen stood, his voice clear and unwavering. I appreciate your offer, but this case isn't about money. It's about restoring what was meant to help generations of families in this city. Mr. Miller's original vision was to ensure that as our city grew, no one would be left behind. I cannot and will not settle for less than the full implementation of that vision. Judge Thompson watched the exchange with growing respect. He had presided over thousands of cases, but rarely had he seen someone so thoroughly prepared and deeply committed to justice rather than personal gain. As the afternoon session began, a surprise witness arrived, the granddaughter of Mr. Miller himself. She had read about the case in the morning paper and driven 3 hours to testify. Her testimony would prove crucial, but that would have to wait until tomorrow. The day ended with Mr. Chen carefully packing up his precious documents. As he walked down the courthouse steps, he passed a group of corporate lawyers huddled around their phones, frantically calling for reinforcements. They had underestimated him, assuming that his humble appearance reflected a simple mind. Now they knew better. A small group of community members waited to thank him, including elderly residents who remembered the neighborhood before Greater Valley's developments changed everything. One old woman pressed a brown paper bag into his hands. Homemade cookies, she explained, because he reminded her of her late husband, another quiet man who fought for what was right. Mr. Chen smiled, touched by the gesture. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he had shown that patience, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to truth could stand against the most powerful opponents. As he walked to the bus stop, the setting sun cast long shadows across the city streets that might soon see the justice they had been denied for so long. The third day of the trial began with an electric atmosphere. Every seat in the courtroom was filled, and Mr. Miller's granddaughter, Mrs. Lee, sat in the front row. She wore a simple blue dress and clutched an old leather photo album in her lap, her silver hair neatly pinned back. When called to the stand, Mrs. Lee's voice trembled slightly as she began to speak. My grandfather wasn't just a businessman, she said, opening the photo album. He was a man who believed in building communities, not just buildings. Every Sunday, he would drive me around the city, pointing out not just his properties, but the families who lived in them. She turned the album toward the judge. Inside were not just family photos, but newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and old property sketches. My grandfather kept everything, she explained. He was especially proud of the trust clause he created. He used to say, "Money builds towers, but compassion builds cities." The corporate lawyers objected immediately. "Your Honor, these personal recollections, while touching, have no bearing on the legal matters at hand." Mrs. Lee's eyes flashed with unexpected fire. "Oh, but they do," she said, pulling out a sealed envelope from the album. "Because my grandfather knew something like this might happen. He left this letter with me, to be opened only if his wishes for the properties were ever challenged." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Thompson carefully opened the sealed envelope. The paper inside was yellowed with age, but the handwriting was clear and firm. As he read the contents aloud, the corporate lawyers' faces grew increasingly pale. "In the event that these properties are sold," the judge read, "and should any attempt be made to circumvent the trust clause, this letter serves as testimony to my explicit wishes. I have placed copies of all original deeds and documents with 3 separate parties, my secretary, my banker, and my church. The trust clause is not merely a suggestion, it is the very foundation of these properties' future use." Mr. Chen sat quietly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The letter continued, detailing exactly how Mr. Miller had structured the trust and why. It also included a warning about his son's attempts to change the arrangements even before his death. During the morning recess, the corporate legal team made frantic phone calls. Their carefully constructed defense was unraveling thread by thread. As people mingled in the courthouse corridors, snippets of conversation revealed that similar cases were being discovered in other cities, properties with forgotten charitable clauses, communities denied their rightful benefits. When court resumed, Mrs. Lee shared more from her grandfather's records. She produced photographs of community events held on the properties, newspaper articles about Mr. Miller's philanthropic work, and most damaging of all, a series of letters between Mr. Miller and his son that clearly showed the latter's plans to dismantle his father's charitable legacy. The day before he died, Mrs. Lee testified, her voice strong despite her tears, "My grandfather called me to his hospital room. He told me to keep these records safe and to watch for someone who would care enough about justice to use them. When I read about Mr. Chen in the paper, I knew he was the person my grandfather had been waiting for." The corporate lawyers tried to argue that the letter and additional documents shouldn't be admitted as evidence, but Judge Thompson overruled them. "These documents provide crucial context to the original deeds Mr. Chen discovered," he stated firmly. As the afternoon session progressed, the true scope of the case began to emerge. It wasn't just about a few properties or a single trust fund, it was about a systematic effort to erase a legacy of community support. Mr. Chen and Mrs. Lee's evidence showed how Greater Valley Development Corporation had used similar tactics in other neighborhoods, always finding ways to circumvent or eliminate charitable requirements. A young intern from the corporation's legal team suddenly stood up and asked to approach the bench. Despite his supervisor's attempts to stop him, he revealed that he had discovered internal memos discussing other properties with similar hidden clauses. The corporate lawyers immediately moved to dismiss him, but the damage was done. Judge Thompson called both parties to his chambers. When they emerged an hour later, the tension in the courtroom had shifted. The corporate lawyers looked defeated, while Mr. Chen maintained his usual calm demeanor. Back in open court, the judge addressed the gallery. "What we have witnessed here goes beyond a simple property dispute. We have seen how patience, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to truth can bring light to long-buried injustices." Mrs. Lee invited Mr. Chen to sit with her during the afternoon break. They shared a thermos of tea as she showed him more family photographs, including ones of her grandfather standing proudly in front of the original Miller building. "He would have liked you," she said softly. "You have his same quiet determination." As the day's session drew to a close, the corporate legal team requested time to consult with their clients about a possible resolution. But everyone in the courtroom knew that any settlement would have to address not just the financial aspects, but the decades of community impact. Outside the courthouse, a small group of elderly residents had set up chairs, sharing stories about the neighborhood as it used to be. They had started bringing homemade lunches for Mr. Chen, refusing to let him eat alone on his courthouse bench anymore. The media coverage had grown, with national news outlets picking up the story. But Mr. Chen continued his same routine, arriving early each morning with his worn briefcase, sitting quietly through the proceedings, and taking careful notes. He wasn't interested in fame or publicity, he was focused solely on seeing justice done. As he packed up his documents that evening, Mrs. Li touched his arm gently. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being the guardian my grandfather hoped for." Mr. Chen simply nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Tomorrow would bring the corporation's response to all these revelations, but for now, the truth was finally coming to light, illuminating decades of shadows with its clear, unwavering beam. On the fourth day of the trial, Greater Valley Development Corporation's CEO himself made an appearance in the courtroom. He sat behind his legal team, his expensive watch glinting under the fluorescent lights as he whispered urgently to his attorneys. The corporation had called an emergency board meeting the previous night, and rumors of internal conflict had already reached the local press. The morning began with a surprising announcement from the corporate legal team. Their lead attorney stood, straightening his tie nervously. "Your Honor, in light of recent revelations, we would like to present new evidence of our own." A murmur ran through the courtroom as he continued, "Several of our long-term employees have come forward with information they feel is relevant to this case." The first witness was a retired accounting clerk who had worked for Greater Valley for over 30 years. Her hands shook as she testified about a separate set of books she had been instructed to maintain, specifically dealing with the Miller properties. "I knew it wasn't right," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I kept copies of everything, hidden away in my basement all these years. When I saw this case on the news, I knew it was time to come forward." Mr. Chen listened intently, taking notes in his careful handwriting. He showed no triumph or satisfaction at these revelations, only the same patient attention he had maintained throughout the trial. During a brief recess, Mrs. Li squeezed his hand. "You've started an avalanche," she whispered. Indeed, as the day progressed, more employees came forward. A former project manager revealed how the company had systematically rewritten property histories. A retired security guard testified about late-night document shredding sessions he had witnessed. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle Mr. Chen had spent decades assembling. The CEO's face grew increasingly red as he watched his company's carefully constructed facade crumble. During the lunch break, he was seen arguing heatedly with his legal team in the courthouse corridor. By afternoon, rumors circulated that the board of directors was holding an emergency conference call. But the most dramatic moment came when an elderly gentleman in a wheelchair was brought forward. He introduced himself as a former board member of Greater Valley, who had served during the crucial period when the Miller properties were acquired. "I've been living with this guilt for 20 years, he said, his voice wavering. "We knew about the trust clause. We knew what we were doing was wrong. But the potential profits were too tempting, and we convinced ourselves that no one would ever discover the truth." The corporate lawyers scrambled to object, but Judge Thompson let the testimony continue. The former board member detailed meetings where strategies were discussed to hide the trust clause, including the deliberate misfiling of documents and the strategic firing of employees who asked too many questions. Mr. Chen's quiet persistence had cracked open more than just one case, it had exposed decades of systematic manipulation. As the afternoon wore on, the judge called both parties to his chambers again. This time, they remained there for over 2 hours. When they emerged, the change in atmosphere was palpable. The CEO had loosened his tie, his earlier arrogance replaced by a look of resignation. The lead corporate attorney addressed the court, "Your Honor, after careful consideration and consultation with our board of directors, Greater Valley Development Corporation would like to propose a comprehensive settlement. The terms they outlined were unprecedented. Not only would the original trust clause be reinstated, but the corporation would establish a much larger community development fund to compensate for decades of lost benefits. They would also create an independent oversight committee to review all their property holdings for similar hidden clauses. But Mr. Chen wasn't finished. He stood slowly, his worn shoes scuffing against the courtroom floor. "While I appreciate the corporation's offer," he said, "any settlement must include provisions for other communities that might have been affected. This isn't just about our city anymore." The gallery erupted in applause, quickly silenced by Judge Thompson's gavel. But the judge himself was smiling slightly as he ordered both parties to work out expanded settlement terms that would address these broader concerns. As news of the development spread, more people gathered outside the courthouse. Community organizers from other cities arrived, carrying records of their own suspicious property deals. Journalists set up cameras on the courthouse steps, broadcasting updates to a nation that had become captivated by the story of an elderly janitor who had outmaneuvered a corporate giant. During the afternoon break, Mrs. Lee shared more from her grandfather's photo album. There was a picture of the original Miller Building groundbreaking ceremony, where her grandfather had spoken about his vision for a city where progress and compassion could coexist. "He believed in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things," she said, looking at Mr. Chen. "Just like you." The corporate legal team worked late into the evening, drafting new settlement terms. Through the courthouse windows, they could see the growing crowd outside holding a candlelight vigil. Someone had hung a banner that read, "Justice has no expiration date." Mr. Chen sat on his usual bench, sharing homemade dumplings brought by supporters. A young law student asked him how he felt about becoming a symbol of hope for so many people. He thought for a moment before responding, "Sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, you discover you're not standing alone." As the sun set on the fourth day of the trial, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about property deeds and trust clauses anymore, it was about the power of truth to prevail against all odds, about the courage of ordinary people to stand up for what's right, and about the ripple effects of one person's unwavering commitment to justice. Tomorrow would bring the formal presentation of the expanded settlement terms, but the victory was already evident in the faces of the community members who had gathered to witness history being made. Mr. Chen packed up his briefcase with the same careful attention he had shown every day, each document a piece of the truth he had protected for so long. As he walked down the courthouse steps, people stood in respectful silence, recognizing that they were watching more than the end of a court case. They were witnessing the triumph of patience, perseverance, and the quiet power of unwavering determination. The fifth day of the trial began differently than the others. Instead of the usual tension, there was an air of anticipation as people filed into the courtroom. News crews gathered outside, and the courthouse steps were crowded with community members holding signs of support. Inside, every bench was filled, with people standing along the walls. Greater Valley's legal team arrived early, carrying boxes of documents, not evidence this time, but draft settlement agreements. The corporation's CEO sat quietly in his expensive suit, looking somehow smaller than he had the day before. Beside him sat several board members who had flown in overnight for this historic moment. Mr. Chen entered last, walking slowly but purposefully to his usual spot. He wore the same worn suit he'd worn all week, but someone had pinned a fresh flower to his lapel, a gift from the courthouse gardener who had been following the case. Judge Thompson called the court to order, his voice carrying authority and something else, perhaps pride in witnessing justice unfold in his courtroom. "Before we proceed with the settlement terms," he announced, "I understand Mr. Chen has something to say." Standing with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the trial, Mr. Chen addressed the court. "Your Honor, over the past few days, I've received hundreds of letters from people across the country. They tell stories similar to ours: communities changed, promises forgotten, documents mysteriously altered. This settlement must do more than correct one historical wrong. It must create a path forward for all those who seek justice. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. I've spent the night reviewing the corporation's proposed terms. While they are generous, they don't address the systemic issues that allowed this to happen. With the court's permission, I'd like to propose some additions. The corporate lawyers exchanged glances, but their client nodded slowly. The CEO stood up, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, if I may speak. At the judge's nod, he continued, this case has forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our company's past. Mr. Chen's additions to the settlement, whatever they may be, deserve our full consideration. For the next several hours, the court heard the detailed terms of what would become known as the Miller settlement. It went far beyond financial compensation. The agreement included the establishment of a public database of all historical property deeds and trust clauses, creation of an independent oversight committee with community representation, funding for legal aid to help other communities research their property histories, a commitment to incorporate affordable housing in all future developments, educational programs about property rights and community development, regular public audits of development projects. Mrs. Lee watched from her seat, tears streaming down her face. My grandfather would be so proud, she whispered to those around her. Not just of the outcome, but of how it was achieved, with dignity, persistence, and unwavering faith in justice. During the lunch recess, something unexpected happened. The CEO approached Mr. Chen's bench, asking to share his simple lunch. As they sat together, the powerful executive and the humble janitor found common ground in their hopes for the city's future. I've been asking myself, the CEO admitted, how many other Mr. Chens are out there, protecting pieces of truth we've tried to bury. Maybe it's time for our company to start building communities instead of just buildings. The afternoon session focused on implementing the settlement terms. Experts in community development were called in to advise on the structure of the oversight committee. Civil rights attorneys offered suggestions for making the legal aid program accessible to all. Urban planners presented ideas for integrating affordable housing into existing developments. But perhaps the most touching moment came when the courthouse maintenance staff appeared in court, led by the night janitor. They presented Mr. Chen with a gift, a new briefcase, handmade by one of their relatives. You've shown us that every job has dignity, their spokesperson said, and that true justice doesn't care what suit you're wearing. As the day progressed, the settlement took its final shape. Judge Thompson reviewed each provision carefully, occasionally suggesting refinements to ensure the agreement would stand the test of time. The corporate lawyers, who had once laughed at Mr. Chen, now treated him with profound respect, seeking his input on various details. Late in the afternoon, a group of law students who had been following the case presented their own contribution, a detailed plan for documenting the entire case as a teaching tool for future generations. Your story needs to be preserved, they told Mr. Chen, not just the legal precedent, but the human story of perseverance and dignity. Mrs. Rodriguez, the former secretary who had testified earlier in the week, returned to court with a surprise of her own. She had discovered more of Mr. Miller's personal papers in her attic, including a journal where he had written about his hopes for the city's future. As she read excerpts aloud, many in the courtroom were moved to tears by how closely Mr. Chen's actions had aligned with Mr. Miller's original vision. As the sun began to set, Judge Thompson prepared to make the settlement official. But before he could speak, Mr. Chen asked for one final addition to the agreement. Let the record show, he said, his voice clear and strong, that this settlement is dedicated to every person who ever felt powerless against a system they thought was too big to challenge. Let it remind us that justice may be slow, but it is persistent, like water wearing away stone. The judge smiled, adding the dedication to the official record. As he signed the final documents, the gallery erupted in applause. Decades of injustice were being corrected, not with violence or revenge, but with wisdom, patience, and an unwavering commitment to truth. Outside the courthouse, the evening news crews captured the moment as Mr. Chen emerged, carrying both his old briefcase and his new one. When asked how he felt, he looked at the crowd of supporters, the CEO standing respectfully to one side, Mrs. Li beaming proudly, and all the ordinary people who had become part of this extraordinary journey. "Today," he said softly, "we've proven that the law, when properly served, knows no distinction between the powerful and the humble. It asks only that we stand firmly for what is right, no matter how long the road may be." 1 month after the historic settlement, the old Miller building buzzed with new energy. The once quiet lobby had been transformed into a community center, where residents gathered to learn about their property rights and access legal resources. Mr. Chen's small desk sat in the corner, where he spent a few hours each day helping people understand their deeds and documents. The changes were already visible throughout the city. Greater Valley Development Corporation had begun retrofitting their luxury developments to include affordable housing units. The CEO, true to his word, had appointed community representatives to the board of directors. Construction sites now displayed large signs showing exactly how each project would benefit the local community. On a warm Saturday morning, Mr. Chen arrived at the Miller building wearing his familiar worn suit, but with a new spring in his step. Today was special, the first meeting of the Community Oversight Committee, established by the settlement. As he entered the conference room, he found Mrs. Li already there, arranging old photographs of her grandfather on the walls alongside news clippings about the trial. "Look what I found," she said, holding up a faded photograph. It showed her grandfather standing in this very room, surrounded by community members. He always said this building should be a lighthouse for the community. Now it finally is. The committee meeting brought together an unlikely group: former residents who had been displaced, current development executives, urban planners, and community activists. They sat around a large table, reviewing proposals for new projects that would balance progress with preservation, profit with purpose. During a break, the CEO of Greater Valley approached Mr. Chen. "Our lawyers found something interesting," he said, placing a folder on the table. "There are similar trust clauses in properties across 5 other states. We're not waiting to be sued this time, we're actively reaching out to those communities to make things right." The news spread quickly. Other development companies, seeing the positive public response to Greater Valley's transformation, began reviewing their own historical documents. Law firms offered pro bono services to help communities research their property histories. The ripple effects of Mr. Chen's victory continued to spread. Back in the courthouse, Judge Thompson had turned his chambers into an informal museum of the case. The worn briefcase Mr. Chen had carried throughout the trial sat in a place of honor, alongside Mrs. Li's photo album and the original Miller documents. Law students often visited, studying how one man's patience and dedication had changed the face of property law. The young intern who had spoken up during the trial had been hired by a public interest law firm, where he specialized in helping other communities uncover hidden property rights. He often cited Mr. Chen's methodical approach as his inspiration, showing that sometimes the quietest voices speak the loudest truths. Mrs. Rodriguez, the former secretary, had started a program teaching elderly residents how to preserve their important documents and family histories. "Every piece of paper tells a story," she would say, echoing Mr. Chen's words. "And every story deserves to be heard." The courthouse maintenance staff had noticed a change too. More lawyers and executives now greeted them by name, asking about their families and listening to their perspectives. The night janitor who had succeeded Mr. Chen in the law firms took pride in keeping the legal libraries organized, knowing that knowledge could empower anyone who sought it. 1 year after the settlement, the city held a ceremony in front of the Miller building. The mayor unveiled a small plaque that read, "Justice grows in the gardens of patience, tended by those who believe in tomorrow." Mr. Chen had chosen the words himself, insisting that it mention neither his name nor his victory. But perhaps the most significant change was invisible to most. In law schools across the country, professors now taught the Chen doctrine, the principle that time could not erase justice, and that truth had no expiration date. His methodical note-taking, careful preservation of documents, and unwavering dignity had become a model for a new generation of lawyers who believed in using the law to protect the powerless. Greater Valley's stock price, after an initial dip, had risen steadily as investors recognized the value of ethical development. The company's new approach had attracted partners who saw community support as an asset rather than an obstacle. Other corporations began following their lead, realizing that profit and social responsibility could coexist. Mr. Chen himself remained unchanged by his fame. He still took the bus to the Miller Building each morning, carried his lunch in a paper bag, and spent hours helping others understand their rights. When asked about his victory, he would smile gently and say, "The only victory that matters is the one that helps others win too." The neighborhood around the Miller Building flourished. Where there had been luxury condos standing empty, now there were mixed-income communities where children played together in shared gardens. The homeless shelters supported by the original trust had expanded into comprehensive community centers, offering job training, healthcare, and hope. On quiet evenings, Mr. Chen would sometimes sit in the Miller Building lobby, watching people come and go. Young families moving into their first homes, elderly residents aging in place with dignity, small business owners keeping their shops in the neighborhoods they loved, each one a testament to the power of preserved promises. Mrs. Lee often joined him, bringing tea and stories about her grandfather. Together, they would look at the old photographs and the new faces, seeing how past and present wove together into a tapestry of community. "You know," she said one evening, "some people build with bricks and mortar, but others build with truth and patience. My grandfather would say you built the stronger foundation." The final chapter of Mr. Chen's story was still being written, not in courtrooms or legal documents, but in the daily lives of people he had never met. In cities across the country, other hidden histories were coming to light. Other quiet voices were finding the courage to speak. Other patient souls were proving that justice, like wisdom, grew stronger with time. As the sun set on another day at the Miller Building, Mr. Chen locked up his desk and headed home. A group of law students waited outside, hoping to learn from his experience. A young maintenance worker waved from the stairwell, proudly wearing his uniform. A child playing in the courtyard asked her mother, "Is that the man who saved our home?" But Mr. Chen just smiled, walking slowly through the neighborhood he had helped restore. In his pocket was a small notebook, still recording thoughts and observations. In his heart was the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from lifting them up to see a better way forward. The laughter that had once echoed through a courtroom at his expense had transformed into the joyful sounds of a community reborn. And in the end, that was all the vindication he had ever needed.